This video thoroughly covers everything in Unit 3 of AP Human Geography in just 38 minutes. It's part of my full 5-hour course review, which you can also find on this channel. You'll occasionally see mentions of the 5-hour study guide and FRQ Mastery Playbook. Both are linked in the description if you want to get exam ready in just 5 hours. Otherwise, enjoy the video. Unit 3 in AP Human Geography is titled Cultural Patterns and Processes. It contains 8 lessons. Let's dive into the first lesson. In Topic 3.1, we will begin exploring the concept of culture, which is a core focus in human geography. First, we will define what culture is by looking at 4 key elements of culture. Second, we will describe some common cultural traits. Third, we'll learn about 2 important ways people think about cultural differences: cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. Let's start with exploring the 4 key elements of culture: shared practices, shared technologies, shared attitudes, and shared behaviors. Shared practices are the everyday activities and traditions people follow. These include holidays, celebrations, rules of etiquette, and social customs. For example, shaking hands, eating with chopsticks, or celebrating the New Year in different ways are all cultural practices. Shared technologies are the tools and methods a culture uses in day-to-day life. For example, Aboriginal Australians use boomerangs for hunting. A more modern example is chat technologies, such as WeChat, which is a chat tool widely used by Chinese Americans. Shared attitudes are the beliefs and values that guide how a cultural group view the world. These can include ideas about family roles, gender, religion, and education. For example, some cultures value individual freedom, while others emphasize community responsibility. Shared behaviors are the actions people within a culture take in daily life. These include how people dress, what they eat, how they greet each other, and how they make decisions. Behavior is often shaped by what a culture considers polite, respectful, or proper. Now let's look at cultural traits. There are 3 important cultural traits to understand: food preferences, architecture, and land use. Let's look at each one. Food preferences reflect what people eat, how they prepare it, and what they consider acceptable. For example, rice is a staple food in many Asian cultures, while bread is more common in Europe. Food preferences are shaped by local resources, religion, tradition, and climate. Architecture includes the design of homes, religious buildings, monuments, and public spaces. A mosque with a dome and minaret reflects Islamic culture, while a colonial-style house in the U.S. reflects European influence. Architecture shows how people use space and express their identity. Land use refers to how people shape the environment to meet their needs. For example, one culture might use land for farming, while another uses it for building cities. Sacred spaces, burial grounds, and parks also show how culture influences the way people value and organize land. Together, these traits give each culture a unique identity and help geographers understand how human life varies across space. Next, let's move on to attitudes to cultural difference. When people encounter cultures different from their own, they react in different ways. These reactions shape how people understand, respect, or judge other groups. Geographers and social scientists use 2 important terms to describe these attitudes: cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism is the idea that a culture should be understood based on its own values and beliefs, not compared to another culture. People who use cultural relativism try to understand why a tradition exists, what role it plays in society, and how it fits into that culture's history and values. For example, someone using cultural relativism would try to understand why a community follows certain dress codes or marriage customs without judgment, even if those customs are different from their own. However, some people criticize this approach because suspension of judgment could mean you accept or justify harmful and discriminatory practices that some cultural groups might engage in. Ethnocentrism is the opposite. It is the belief that your own culture is superior to others' cultures. People with an ethnocentric view judge other cultures using their own values as the standard. For example, they might call another culture's food weird or its customs backward. Okay, that's it for Topic 3.1. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. If you're using the FRQ Mastery Playbook, Complete this lesson's exam-style free response practice questions and check your answers. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.2. In this lesson, we will explore how human culture leaves visible marks on the Earth's surface. These marks are known as cultural landscapes. They reflect how people live, work, and express their beliefs. First, we will learn about the different elements that make up cultural landscapes. Then, we will explore how attitudes toward ethnicity and gender influence the way space is organized and controlled in a society. There are 6 major features that make up a cultural landscape: physical features, agricultural and industrial practices, religious and linguistic characteristics, evidence of sequent occupancy, architecture, and land use patterns. Let's go through each one. Physical features include natural elements like mountains, rivers, forests, and climate. These shape how people settle and what they build. For example, terraced farming in mountainous areas or stilt houses in flood-prone regions are adaptations to physical features that become part of the cultural landscape. Agricultural and industrial practices reflect how people use the land to produce food and goods. Rice paddies in Southeast Asia, cornfields in the U.S. Midwest, and factories in urban zones all reveal cultural choices about economic activity. These practices create patterns that are visible from the ground or even from the sky. Religious and linguistic characteristics shape the landscape through places of worship, religious symbols, signage, and language use in public spaces. A town with mosques, Arabic signs, and halal markets shows different cultural traits than a town with cathedrals, Spanish signs, and Catholic schools. Evidence of sequent occupancy shows how different cultural groups have lived in the same place over time. A neighborhood might include Spanish-style missions from one era, Victorian houses from another, and modern glass buildings today. These layers of settlement reveal a history of cultural change and influence. We can also come to understand a cultural landscape through its architecture. The AP Human Geography curriculum requires that you know about traditional and postmodern building styles and how each one reflects cultural values. Traditional architecture reflects long-standing cultural values and construction methods, such as adobe homes or wooden temples. Postmodern architecture uses modern materials, abstract forms, and often blends styles. Both types reflect the values and identities of the communities that build them. Land use patterns show how space is organized and for what purpose. These patterns include residential neighborhoods, farmland, industrial zones, parks, and sacred spaces. For example, a city grid with shopping centers, apartment towers, and subway stations reflects urban planning shaped by cultural values about efficiency, economy, and lifestyle. So far in this lesson, we've learned that cultural landscapes are physical landscapes that have been shaped by human cultural practices. By looking at these landscapes, we can learn things about the cultures that have lived upon those lands. We looked at different ways this occurs, such as through signs and religious monuments, as well as through agricultural practices. We also looked at how different cultures leave different types of marks, such as by having different architectural styles or city designs. The second half of this lesson looks at how cultural landscapes can also be shaped by and reveal cultural attitudes about ethnicity and gender. The AP Human Geography curriculum requires you know about 3 specific cultural practices that shape space: women in the workforce, ethnic neighborhoods, and indigenous communities and lands. Let's explore each one. Women in the workforce can shape how space is used in a society. When more women work outside the home, there is a greater need for things like daycare centers, safe public transportation, and jobs closer to home. Cities may build more childcare centers or plan neighborhoods that make it easier for parents to balance work and family. Ethnic neighborhoods also shape cultural landscapes. These neighborhoods often have stores, restaurants, and places of worship that reflect their shared traditions and language. For example, there might be a Chinatown or Little Italy in a big city. These areas make people feel connected to their culture and give new immigrants a place to feel welcome. They also help cities plan services and celebrate cultural diversity through things like festivals and special events. Indigenous communities and lands also shape cultural landscapes. Many indigenous people live on land that has special meaning to them, like forests, rivers, or mountains. They often care for the environment in ways that are different from cities or businesses. Because of this, some areas are protected from development This helps the land stay healthy and preserves the cultural identity and history of indigenous groups. Okay, that brings us to the end of topic 3.2. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.3. In this lesson, we will explore regional patterns that shape cultural landscapes. We can break these down into how language, religion, and ethnicity contribute to shaping a space. Then we'll study how these same traits can act as unifying and dividing forces. Let's go through each cultural trait, language, religion, and ethnicity, to see how it affects space and place. Language is one of the most important ways people communicate and express identity. In regions where a common language is spoken, it can create unity and a strong sense of belonging. For example, French is a defining feature of Quebec's identity in Canada. Religion also shapes landscapes and gives meaning to places. Places of worship, churches, mosques, temples, shrines, become landmarks in religious communities. Religious traditions influence land use, dress codes, diets, and holidays. For example, cities in predominantly Muslim regions may have daily calls to prayer and mosques with minarets. In Catholic areas, saints' names often appear in street names and city titles. Sacred sites like the Western Wall in Jerusalem or the Ganges River in India are tied deeply to religious identity and placemaking. Ethnicity refers to shared cultural traits, history, or ancestry. Ethnic groups often cluster in specific regions, where their culture shapes housing styles, business types, food options, and festivals. These areas may form ethnic enclaves, places like Little Italy or Chinatown, which we discussed in the last lesson. The ethnic enclaves become symbols of cultural pride and social support. Together, these patterns give regions a distinct cultural identity and create a visible sense of place. Now let's look at the concepts of cultural unity and division within a space. For this, human geographers use the terms centripetal force and centrifugal force. A centripetal force is something that brings people together and strengthens unity. It helps create a sense of shared identity and purpose. Here are some ways language, religion, and ethnicity can be centripetal forces. Language can be a centripetal force when most people in a country speak the same language, helping communication, education, and media run smoothly. For example, in Japan, the use of a single national language contributes to a strong sense of unity. Religion can be a centripetal force because it unites people who share beliefs and values. It can guide moral systems, laws, and community life. For example, shared religion has brought unity in countries like Iran or Israel. Ethnicity can be a strong centripetal force within a single group that shares common ancestry, customs, and traditions. Ethnic pride can lead to cultural preservation and celebration. Now let's look at centrifugal forces. A centrifugal force is something that pulls people apart and creates division or conflict within a country or region. Here are some ways language, religion, and ethnicity can be centrifugal forces. Language can be a centrifugal force when multiple groups speak different languages and feel excluded. In Belgium, tension exists between Dutch-speaking Flemings and French-speaking Walloons, and language divisions have influenced political disagreement. Religion can be a centrifugal force when different religious groups compete for space or political power. In places like Northern Ireland or parts of Nigeria, religious differences have led to conflict and violence. Ethnicity can be a centrifugal force when multiple ethnic groups live in the same area without shared power or mutual respect. Ethnic tension has contributed to division in countries like Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, or Myanmar, where competition over land and identity has led to violence. Okay, that brings us to the end of topic 3.3. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. For this lesson's free response question set, you'll get to practice an exam-style question where you can interpret geographic data about this topic. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.4. In this lesson, we will explore the spread of cultural traits from one place to another. This process is called diffusion. First, we'll divide diffusion into two main types: relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. Then, we'll break expansion diffusion into three specific forms: contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus diffusion. Let's begin with relocation diffusion. This type of diffusion happens when people move and take their cultural traits with them. The culture does not stay and spread from the original location. It is carried somewhere else by the people themselves. For example, when immigrants move to a new country and bring their language, food, or religion with them, they are practicing relocation diffusion. Spanish is spoken in many parts of the Americas because Spanish settlers brought the language during colonial times. The trait moves because the people move. Now let's look at expansion diffusion. In this type, the cultural trait spreads outward from its origin while staying strong at the source. The trait moves from person to person, place to place, growing larger without people having to migrate. For example, when a new slang word, food trend, or fashion style spreads through social media or advertising, it's usually expansion diffusion. Expansion diffusion can happen in 3 different ways: contagious diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, and stimulus diffusion. Contagious diffusion spreads rapidly and widely like a wave. It moves from person to person and place to place with no regard for hierarchy or importance. The idea or trait spreads to everyone it touches. For example, a viral video on the internet that gets shared by millions of people across the world is an example of contagious diffusion. Another example is the spread of a new slang word among teenagers, moving quickly from one friend group to another regardless of location or social class. Hierarchical diffusion spreads from powerful or influential people or places first, then trickles down to others. The idea moves in a specific order, often starting with leaders, celebrities, or large cities. For example, fashion trends often start in global cities like Paris or New York, and then spread to smaller cities and towns. Technology can also follow this pattern, such as when smartphones were first used by wealthy people before becoming common among the general population. Stimulus diffusion occurs when a cultural trait spreads, but only the underlying idea is adopted, not the original form. The receiving culture changes the idea to fit its own needs. For example, fast food restaurants that began in the United States have been adapted in other countries to fit local tastes. A McDonald's in India may serve vegetarian burgers instead of beef, but the concept of fast, convenient meals remains. The core idea spreads, but the final product is different. That brings us to the end of topic 3.4. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.5. In the last lesson, we talked about the different types of cultural diffusion. This lesson builds upon what we've already learned. It explores the historical causes of cultural diffusion. First, we will learn about cultural blending, which explains how cultural traits mix to form new practices and languages. Then, we'll study the role of power and trade in driving cultural diffusion. Let's start with cultural blending. And when people from different cultures interact over time, their customs, languages, and beliefs often blend together. These blends create new cultural forms that didn't exist before. This process is especially visible in language, food, music, religion, and art. There are 2 examples of blended cultural expressions that geographers focus on: creolization and lingua franca. Let's look at each one in turn. Creolization is the process by which elements of different cultures blend to form something entirely new, especially in language, food, and music. For example, in the Caribbean, enslaved Africans, European colonizers, and indigenous peoples interacted for centuries. Over time, they blended languages, music, and cooking styles. Creole languages like Haitian Creole or Jamaican Patois developed from mixing European languages with African languages and local expressions. Creolization also shaped regional music styles like reggae and calypso, and it influenced food traditions that combine African, European, and indigenous ingredients and techniques. These new styles had several cultural influences, but the end products are entirely new and unique cultural artifacts. Lingua franca is a language that is adopted as a common way to communicate between groups that do not share the same native language. A lingua franca is used for trade, travel, and communication, especially in diverse areas. One well-known example is English, which has become a global lingua franca in business, science, and international relations. For example, imagine French, Spanish, and German traders met at a trading post. Each of them have their own first language that the other traders don't understand. Fortunately, they all speak English as a second language, so they communicate with each other in English. In this scenario, English is the lingua franca. Other examples include Swahili in East Africa and Arabic in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. A lingua franca often emerges through cultural contact and becomes a practical tool for communication across different cultures. Now let's explore how power and trade influence cultural diffusion. We will look at three concepts related to power and trade: colonialism, imperialism, and trade practices. Each of these practices contribute to cultural diffusion. Colonialism is when one country takes political control over another area and settles its own people there. European colonial powers such as Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal established colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They spread their languages, religions, laws, education systems, and cultural practices to the places they colonized. For example, English became the dominant language in India, Nigeria, and the Caribbean because of British colonial rule. Christianity also spread widely in colonized regions due to missionary activity. In many places, colonialism changed cultural landscapes permanently. Imperialism is the broader practice of extending power over other areas, not always through settlement. Imperial powers may control a region through military, political, or economic means. For example, the Ottoman Empire expanded its influence through war, economic coercion, and political influence to spread cultural traits across large territories. Imperialism often led to cultural blending, but also to cultural conflict, as dominant groups tried to impose their practices on others. Trade connected people across continents long before airplanes or the internet. The Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan trade routes, and the Indian Ocean trading network allowed the movement of goods but also of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. For example, Islam spread through trade across North and East Africa, bringing religion, language, and architectural styles. The Columbian Exchange brought new foods, animals, and agricultural techniques between the Americas, Europe, and Africa, forever changing diets and farming systems around the world. That's it for topic 3.5. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.6. In the previous lesson, we looked at historical causes of diffusion. In this lesson, we explore contemporary causes. Today's cultural diffusion happens through faster, more connected, and more global processes. First, we'll study how urbanization and globalization influence cultural change. Then we'll look at how a concept known as time-space convergence explains rapid contemporary cultural change around the world. Let's start with urbanization and globalization. Urbanization is the growth of cities as more people move into urban areas. Cities bring people from different backgrounds into close contact, which increases cultural exchange. In cities, people are exposed to new ideas, lifestyles, and practices, often faster than in rural areas. Urbanization spreads trends in fashion, food, music, and language through interactions in schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Cities are hotspots for blending and adapting culture. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of the world through trade, communication, and cultural exchange. It allows cultural traits to spread across countries and continents. For example, people in Brazil may watch American movies, eat Japanese sushi, and wear clothing made in Bangladesh, all in the same day. Globalization allows cultures to mix more quickly, but it also raises concerns about the loss of local identity. These processes work through 5 major pathways: media, technology, politics, economics, and social relationships. Media spreads cultural images and stories worldwide through television, films, social media, and music. A teenager in South Korea might follow the same TikTok trends as a teenager in the United States. Technologies such as the internet and social media speed up cultural diffusion by making it easier to share ideas and traditions across the world. It also enables faster travel and global trade, which spread cultural practices between different regions. Politics affects cultural diffusion by deciding what ideas and practices can spread between countries. Friendly relations and open borders help cultures mix, while strict rules or censorship can limit the spread. Economics affects cultural diffusion by connecting people through trade and jobs. When countries buy and sell goods or workers move for better pay, they also share their cultures. Social relationships affect cultural diffusion because people share their beliefs, traditions, and habits with friends, family, and communities. When people meet and connect, they pass on parts of their culture to others. For this lesson on the contemporary causes of cultural diffusion, the AP Human Geography curriculum also requires that we zoom in on a concept known as time-space convergence. Time-space convergence refers to the idea that distance feels shorter because information, goods, and people move more quickly than ever before thanks to technologies such as airplanes and the internet. What once took weeks or months to spread can now happen in seconds. For example, check this chart out, which is the stimulus chart for this lesson's free response questions. In 1860, it took 365 days to travel around the world. Today, a plane can fly around the world in less than 24 hours. This shows how everything feels closer and faster to access today than ever before. There are three major cultural effects of time-space convergence that we need to know about for AP Human Geography: cultural convergence, cultural divergence, and language change. Let's examine each one. Cultural convergence is when cultures become more similar due to shared exposure to the same ideas, products, or lifestyles. For example, the global popularity of fast food, pop music, or English language movies has created shared cultural experiences around the world. Cultural convergence is common in urban areas and among connected populations who use the same social media platforms or shop from the same global brands. Cultural divergence happens when groups push back against global culture in order to protect or revive their local or traditional identities. In response to the spread of global trends, some communities work harder to preserve their own customs, dress, language, and beliefs. For example, a country might pass laws to protect a minority language from being lost or promote traditional festivals in schools. Divergence reminds us that not all cultures become the same. Many actively resist change. Language change is a major area where time-space convergence has both united and divided people. For example, as we discussed earlier, English has become the lingua franca for global business. This makes it easier for people from different regions to communicate, but it also threatens indigenous languages, which may be spoken by fewer people. As a result, many languages are at risk of disappearing entirely, and efforts are being made to document and preserve them. That brings us to the end of topic 3.6. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. For this lesson's free response question set, you'll get to practice an exam-style question where you can interpret geographic data about this topic. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.7. In this lesson, we will explore how language and religion spread across space from their places of origin. First, we'll examine how languages and religions diffuse from cultural hearths. Then we'll look at how the spread of language families and religious patterns can be shown on visual tools like maps. Finally, we'll look at how universalizing religions and ethnic religions each follow different diffusion paths. Let's start with the concept of cultural hearths. A cultural hearth is the place where a cultural trait begins before spreading to other areas. Both languages and religions have hearths, specific regions where they first developed, and they spread through time and space as people move, trade, or conquer. Languages often spread through migration, conquest, cultural exchange, and colonization. As people move, they take their language with them. Over time, as languages reach new places, they can change, forming new dialects or even entirely new languages. For example, the Indo-European language family began in parts of Eurasia and has since spread across much of Europe, the Americas, and parts of South Asia. English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, and French are all part of this family but developed in different regions from common roots. Religions also spread from hearths, often through a mix of relocation diffusion, which is people moving, and expansion diffusion, which is beliefs spreading without people moving. The way a religion spreads depends on its practices and beliefs. For example, some religions actively seek new followers, while others are passed down through family and tradition. We'll go deeper into how the different types of religions spread later in this lesson. To understand how languages and religions spread, geographers use visual tools such as maps, charts, and toponyms. These tools help make diffusion patterns clear and allow for comparisons across time and space. Maps show the distribution of language families and religions around the world. A map of the Indo-European language family might highlight how English dominates North America, while Hindi is concentrated in India and Russian spreads across Eurasia. Religious maps can show where Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or Hinduism are most common today, often reflecting past migration or conquest. Charts and graphs can show language relationships, like language trees that trace the origins of languages within a family. These trees often show how languages like French, Italian, and Spanish all developed from Latin. Toponyms, or place names, also reflect the spread of culture. A city name like San Francisco shows Spanish and Catholic influence. A name like Mecca Street might reflect Islamic cultural presence in a region. Studying toponyms helps geographers trace the imprint of religion and language on the landscape. Visual tools like these make it easier to understand the lasting effects of cultural diffusion. Now let's dig into the differences between universalizing religions and ethnic religions. If you're using the study guide as you watch, now's the time to fill out the universalizing versus ethnic religions comparison table. Pay close attention to the table row, comparing the differences in diffusion patterns, as this point is strongly emphasized in the AP Human Geography curriculum. Universalizing religions are belief systems that seek to appeal to all people, regardless of their culture or location. They are open to converts and aim to spread widely. These religions typically diffuse through both expansion and relocation diffusion. There are four main universalizing religions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Sikhism. Let's explore each one briefly. Christianity originated in the Middle East, specifically in present-day Israel and Palestine. It spread through expansion and relocation diffusion as missionaries and colonizers carried it across the Roman Empire, into Europe, and eventually to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Islam also began in the Middle East in what is now Saudi Arabia. It spread rapidly through expansion diffusion, especially military conquest, and through trade routes reaching North Africa, Central Asia, and parts of Europe. It also spread through relocation diffusion as Muslim traders and migrants settled in new regions. Buddhism originated in India and spread through expansion diffusion, especially along trade routes like the Silk Road. It moved east into China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Buddhist missionaries, scholars, and pilgrims helped spread its teachings. Sikhism started in the Punjab region of South Asia and has spread mainly through relocation diffusion, as Sikh communities moved to the United Kingdom, Canada, and other parts of the world. While small, it is still considered a universalizing religion because of its openness to conversion and its universal theology. Each of these religions has spread far beyond its hearth, reshaping cultural landscapes across continents. In contrast to universalizing religions, ethnic religions are belief systems that are closely tied to a specific place or ethnic group. These religions do not actively seek converts and tend to remain near their place of origin. As a result, ethnic religions mostly spread through relocation diffusion and often remain clustered near their hearths. There are two major examples of ethnic religions geographers study: Hinduism and Judaism. Hinduism began in the Indus River Valley and remains most strongly practiced in India and Nepal. It has not spread far beyond South Asia through expansion, but has reached other parts of the world, especially the US, the UK, and East Africa, through relocation diffusion as Hindu populations migrated. Judaism originated in the Middle East, but over time, Jewish communities have spread globally through diaspora movements, forced or voluntary migration due to persecution, trade, or conflict. Today, large Jewish populations exist in Israel, the United States, and parts of Europe. While Judaism has spread widely, it remains ethnic because it is typically passed down within families and is closely tied to cultural identity and tradition. Ethnic religions shape cultural landscapes through synagogues, temples, burial practices, and holiday celebrations. but their reach is usually more localized compared to universalizing religions. That brings us to the end of topic 3.7. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 3.8. In this lesson, we will study the effects of cultural diffusion. When people from different backgrounds meet, whether through migration, trade, or media, the result is often some level of cultural blending or change. In this lesson, we'll focus on 4 key outcomes: acculturation, assimilation, syncretism, and multiculturalism. Each of these terms describes a different kind of response to cultural interaction. Acculturation occurs when a person or group adopts some traits of another culture, usually one that is more dominant, while still keeping parts of their original culture. For example, immigrants to a new country may learn the local language and follow new laws, but still eat traditional foods and celebrate holidays from their culture of origin. Acculturation allows people to adapt while also preserving their identity. It's a two-way process that reflects partial change, not total replacement. Assimilation happens when a person or group fully adopts the traits of another culture, often losing their original cultural identity in the process. This may happen over generations, especially if there is pressure to fit in. For example, children of immigrants might stop speaking their parents' native language and only use the dominant language of their new country. In some cases, assimilation is voluntary, but in others, it may be forced through policies that ban native traditions or languages. Assimilation leads to cultural homogeneity, where differences become less visible. Syncretism is the process by which 2 or more cultural traits blend together to create something new. This is common in religion, art, food, and music. For example, in Latin America, Catholic traditions merged with indigenous beliefs to create new religious practices. In language, Creole languages are examples of syncretism, combining vocabulary and grammar from several languages into one new system. Syncretism reflects creativity and cultural exchange, often forming something unique that neither culture had before. Multiculturalism refers to a society where multiple cultures exist together and are respected as equally valid. In multicultural societies, people are encouraged to keep their cultural traditions while participating in the larger society. This can be seen in cities like Toronto or London, where many ethnic neighborhoods exist side by side, each with its own language, food, and customs. Multiculturalism supports diversity and inclusion, and it is often promoted through policies, education, and public celebrations of different cultures. Each of these outcomes shows a different way that culture evolves when people from different backgrounds interact. They help geographers understand how traditions change, survive, or combine over time in response to global movement and exchange. Okay, that's it for topic 3.8. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we can move on to Unit 4.